You were diagnosed with ADHD later on in life, and you found a way to reframe it and help you thrive in your Martech role at Expedia.
I think I've been drawn a lot to marketing or operations or places that can feel like chaos. It's like 1 plus 1 can equal 2 sometimes, but occasionally it's these 8 other options because it kept my brain busy. It's definitely been a little bit of a reframe and a rewiring. Like I can connect dots pretty quickly. Super useful in a operation issue that has a long chain of events that happen.
This whole shift helped you achieve a stronger bridge between execution and vision.
Execution is about persuading people. It's convincing a whole bunch of people that don't work for you to say, please, can you do this thing for me? Because it's going to make my life easier. That itself deserves a lot more credit than the
Mhm.
strategy.
What's up, everyone? Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Angela Vega, Director of Capabilities and Operations at Expedia Group. In this episode, we explore Angela's ADHD Martech stack and why ADHD helps marketers build better systems. She explains how to build a bridge between strategy and execution and how to use discernment to protect your energy. All that and a bunch more stuff after a quick word from two of our awesome partners. This episode is brought to you by Mammoth Growth. Ever feel like your data is lying to you? Like you're making big bets on numbers you don't even trust? Everyone talks about garbage in, garbage out, but almost no one actually fixes the garbage. That's where Mammoth Growth comes in. They're the fastest AI powered data team on the planet. They build production ready data architecture that turns your fragmented customer data into one unified, trustworthy source of truth fast. Most companies spend months trying to get answers. Mammoth Growth compresses weeks of analytics engineering into minutes using a multi-agent AI workflow. No rework, no broken dashboards, just clean, reliable data models you can act on with confidence. Calendly, Siemens, TED, and hundreds of other brands trust Mammoth Growth to fuel measurable growth. Check them out at mammothgrowth.com to see how they make bad data disappear.
This episode is brought to you by Revenue Hero.
Two field forms: complete context, instant scheduling. Finally, you get to pick all three without a single line of code. Introducing Native Enrichment by Revenue Hero. Plug in Clearbit, Crust Data, Apollo, or stack all three. Enrich all the data you need instantly on Submit. Stack your enrichment providers, waterfall your way to clarity. Determine qualification and meeting routing based on enriched information. Layer it onto your current distribution logic. Book more meetings with your qualified buyers. Get started at revenuehero.io.
Angela, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to chat.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually nice to talk about Martech here other than Slacks at 10 p.m. So this is definitely preferable.
I feel that from my in-house journey for sure. I'm a big fan of using that like schedule send button when you're sending a DM to someone that you know isn't on right now and you're probably having dinner and you don't want to like annoy them.
No, I do that. I love using like actually looking like I'm already up in the morning. So I schedule it for like 5 a.m. my
Yes.
time. And, it's like 9 or 10 theirs. And I'm like, wow, she's already up. But, you have to use it strategically. But yes, I usually end up getting on Slack a lot later than necessary due to working with a global team. So it can be rough.
Yeah, pro tip, making people think that you start
Yeah,
work
pro
a
tip.
lot earlier.
Schedule everything.
Yeah, no, I'm super pumped to chat today because I feel like, a lot of us in marketing and operations are feeling this constant pressure of productivity, getting stuff out the door. And with that comes this undercurrent of anxiety. You were diagnosed with ADHD later on in life, and you found a way to reframe it and help you thrive in your Martech role at Expedia. And you found a way to blend ADHD and your Martech career. Talk to us about this ADHD tech stack that you've put together.
It was something I started to think a lot more about, especially as the onslaught of like AI tools started to explode. And
Hmm.
I got a really deep interest in, using a lot of them for my own personal use. But then once I started realizing how much more I was getting done by kind of like leveraging some of these tools to help support me on my way, I was like, this, I don't know, there's something here for the person who's like, you know, working, managing a household with the kids, trying to have really good conversations, across the board in their industry and things of that sort. And so what I started thinking out, and while I'm making it general right now, there is an aspect of this that I would like to go a little bit more towards women, because there's so much of that where I believe that they need that sort of support and space. But this one was meant to kind of be a little bit more open to, the general sort of public. But essentially, the way I think about it is something that executive functioning is one of the most critical aspects that, most people struggle with who have ADHD. And that executive functioning is like when you have too much information, or you don't know exactly where to start, or being able to take that sort of first action with things can be really, really challenging. And that was something that I struggled with too. I had so many coping mechanisms, with list, sticky notes, the reminders. I'm one of those people that has like 18 alarms like on my phone to remind me for certain things. Like all those sorts of things are great tools. But technology's evolved. There's better tools now.
Mhm.
We should use
Mhm.
them, and they should be in a way that isn't about, like, figuring out how to make things faster, at work, or being able to answer that one question that Google would have done totally fine with, but your grandmother doesn't know how to use it yet. Like, we we should use these in a way that actually help create a world and environment for peoples whose brains did not match the environment that we had previously,
Mm.
which is people who are trying to manage several different tasks, who don't know how to break sometimes things down into things, who don't understand what the next step, who step away from a thing when they come back to it, they're like, what was I doing? What was this thing that I was trying to accomplish here? And so what I basically am starting to build outside of, I have, the general framework around it, which is the idea of like offload, shape, prototype, loop, and anchor. All these are attached to like very typical things that, I have personally struggled with, at least my version of how ADHD shows up. But the first part is really around the offload. It's just I talk out loud all the time. Like when I'm alone, shower, I'm sure a ton of people sort of do it, but usually it's because I'm trying to figure out how to say a thing, and auditory processing helps me. But instead of just doing that into the abyss, or into, behind my toddler's whatever Moana song and just saying it to myself, I say it into, an AI, whether it's Whisper
Mhm.
or whether it's GPT or whether it's one of the gens from Gemini that I crafted to be specific to my needs, on saying this one is specific to um, the things I need to get done. This one is about the list I need to send my boss about the
Mhm.
things that I'm trying to action on, which then leads to shape. Because at that point, its ability to be able to create a framework, you can design it or something, or you can prompt it in a way that allows you to give it the right context and things. Prototyping is more around the idea that like we get so caught up in our like the ability to do a thing. People like, yeah, I'm really into this thing now. And then like 2 weeks later, like, I'm not into this thing anymore. Because you can't get to the result that you have in your brain about what that dopamine hit is going to be, right? And so now the ability, when someone has an idea saying like, look, I want to create an app for a thing like this isn't like, 2 months of trying to figure this out. This is like 2 minutes of you writing some stuff into Replit, into Lovable, into pick whatever sort of AI app. And then you get to that sort of point. And then loop is more about body doubling, right? It's the idea of being able to have your ideas and have a conversation with it and not feeling judged, right? Because a lot of the times when we're saying things out loud, I repeat myself all the time with my husband. He's like, we talked about this yesterday. And I'm like, I know, I'm still thinking about it and I still need to talk through it. Now I don't have to necessarily bother him with all the things around it, but you can loop with that and it's in a judgment free. Now there's some aspect of like AI that, right? Like they're all about like, they're not going to say like, girl, no, don't do that. They're not going to tell you no. Um, but if it's just something that you need to chew on and ruminate and then structure, that's a good thing. And then anchoring is more about the struggle of being able to come back to ideas. And that's where AI can allow you to kind of like prompt, you say like, where did I leave off? What was this thing that I was sort of doing? And there's so many other things with AI workflows and, orchestration. And there's so many great apps that are coming out. But each of these tech stacks, what you need can be very, very different and customizable to you as a person. And that's the whole point, is like we shouldn't have to accept this one sort of tool, sticky notes or this. It can be so much more robust than that. But not only that, it can be so personalized to each individual and the things that they have in their life. And that's what I want to enable anybody else with struggling with some level of executive function, that they can build their own tech stack and they don't need my experience or anybody else's like technical expertise to do that.
Hmm. Super cool. Yeah, we'll put up the actual diagram for folks that are watching this on YouTube. I think it's a really cool way to think about it. So maybe take us back to like that first initial diagnosis, right? Like I know for you that moment kind of reframed everything about how you lead at work, but also at home as a parent. So yeah, take us back to that moment. Like what was happening in your life and career? How did it change how you kind of see yourself as a Martech leader?
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting because for people who do decide to get diagnosed with any aspect of depression, anxiety, neurodivergence, it's one of those things that I think some people feel like this instant relief, like, "Ah, this thing, I knew it was there."
Hmm.
For others, it's like, "Yeah, no, that makes sense." It just feels so clear. And I know for me, when you kinda, like, look at photos, like, from 10 years ago, and, 10 years ago, you're complaining, "I didn't like this wasn't fun," or, "I wish I would've worn my hair like that." But now you kind of look at them, you're like, "How fun was that?"
Hmm.
There's a part of me that now that I've been able to get, an understanding, a better understanding of myself, but more information about, not who I am, but how aspects of my brain work that
Hmm.
has allowed me to look in the past and be a little bit more gracious with those experiences that I've had and kind of reframe them, almost relive them, say, "Oh, no, that was just a way in which I was processing it." And then, like, more in the present, it is more like a pair of glasses. I know a lot of people kind of compare that sort of thing. You just get a little bit more focus, a little bit more clarity. Um, so for me, you know, the path of diagnosis, to shorten the story just a little bit, is after I had my first son, there was a lot of things going on that, you know, the toolkit that I had, therapy or coping mechanisms just really weren't working anymore. So I went to my OB and was able to get, my first medication around anxiety, but it wasn't necessarily properly diagnosed. It was an outcome of a experience that I had that a lot of people have, a lot of birthing people have, that can be super traumatic, and that's what I needed at that time. And then shortly after, about a year later, we decided let's go ahead and, take the next step and add another human being to our lives. And so we did our second transfer. Both of my children were, through IVF. And so after about a year struggling with that, that also kind of compounded in some of the aspects of anxiety. But for that second sort of transfer, at that point in my life, specifically, we had my father-in-law became very, very sick, and I've known the man since I was 19. And he unfortunately then passed away about a month later. I was pregnant with my, second child, and unfortunately, the complexity of both being like sick and then also having anxiety, the medications I were taking caused something called serotonin syndrome. So I had to choose
Hmm.
between my medications, which, for those of you who don't know, it's like, do you want to throw up or do you want to feel anxious? And to be perfectly honest, I would prefer to feel anxious because throwing up several times a day is just not fun for anyone.
Yeah.
um, and then there was a lot of stuff going on at work. It wasn't really an environment at that time that was conducive to, I think, a person who was, I don't want to say struggling, but definitely had complexities in their life that really weren't making room for the fact that as a leader and as someone who needed to show up at their sort of best,
Hmm.
that it just didn't really exist at that time.
Yeah.
Um, and so through that, I was lucky, got a great maternity leave, came back, and my role again began to shift. But within about a year after that, I was like, "Man, I need to probably actually go get a proper diagnosis." And so I went to a psychologist, and with that, started explaining like all my symptoms, like, "Oh, I have a lot of thoughts in my head. Sometimes super hard to, fall asleep. I think of the 20 things that might go wrong. Here's the 100 hobbies that I have. My I already have 15 water cups right next to me as we speak." Like, and those weren't like the actual things that I explained to the therapist, but it was
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
that she started kind of, asking. And then she says, "Hey, you might this is also kind of showing up as, ADHD." And at that point, as typical people would do, at least what I was taught, I was like, "No. I can sit still. I mean, I fidget, but I can sit still. They're like, yeah, so that is a what was used in the 1990s, the description
Mm,
of all this. So much of this has changed, and the way that, it shows up in women can definitely be more, in their head. And then there's so many other factors associated with what society expects of girls or women that, sitting still is expected, getting good grades is expected. While those same sorts of things aren't necessarily, put on, little boys. And that's not right nor fair,
mm,
but it is a bias that, between, the social expectations of people as well as what the data and the doctors were trained on, that it wasn't very common that, you would look at a little girl who was thinking about a billion things in her head while they were trying to teach a math problem and then asking her a question, but she knows she has to come up with the answer because if she doesn't, she's a failure, right? There's all these narratives that lead up, but the point being is, the psychologist was like, "You most likely have this. Would you like some medication?" I was like, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go take a 6-hour test that's going to make me, like, just wanna fall asleep afterwards." That was all about, assessing that sort of experience. And so with that, I came out, peer reviewed by, 2 or 3 other psychologists because that was important to me personally to make sure that this wasn't something that I was making up, right? Because that's the narrative that I
mhm.
have in my head. It's just a thing I have there, And, I, also had a really good friend who had made a suggestion to go to this sort of place, where they did all this sort of testing. And it came out that it was, ADHD, combined type, hyperactive, inactive, and then, of course, anxiety. And so now I'm able to kind of like think about all of the what I think I considered quirks for a super long time and think about them a little bit, differently now. And how that shows up at work, like I said, is I think I've been drawn a lot to marketing or operations or places that can feel like chaos that aren't this like numerical mathematical situation that, 1
Mhm.
plus 1 equals 2, but it's like 1 plus 1 can equal 2 sometimes, but occasionally it's these 8 other options. Because it kept my brain busy. It made me
Right.
feel like I could do, 100 different things,
Hmm.
and so it's definitely been a little bit of a reframe and a rewiring, and giving myself a little bit more grace, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I, I look back on your answer there, and like a couple of things jump out. Obviously, ton of stuff going on in your life, and your expectation to still kind of show up at work. And I know a lot of folks listening are probably just like, you have to figure out a way to not let it affect your work. Like people still expect you to perform and be productive, and it's so easier said than done when you like close a laptop and then you're dealing with these like 17 different things that are going on in your life. But when you mentioned like you treated your quirks as flaws before the diagnosis, like what were some of those quirks? Like take us back, and like how do you think they affected the way that you showed up to your Martech job?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And some of these things, these, like I said, these quirks still sort of exist in behaviors, and to your point, it's really about how I'm, like, thinking about them more neutrally
Mhm.
as, like, it's just about using a tool set, and all tools are neutral until you decide what's the best way to really apply them, right? So some of the things that I know I do, and I still do today, and I will probably continue to do for the rest of my life, is I can jump from like one topic to another pretty quickly because in my mind I've already created like 5 connections, and then I have to go back and talk. And that works like sometimes pretty well at a leadership level that you can like make a statement and then get to hear, and then some people can kind of follow you. It
Mhm.
does not work when you're in a very tactical and you need to explain things and understand how you got there. And so I've learned to kind of break things into smaller steps, but it is a really good skill set that if you have a short period of time to where you need to explain something, your ability to find that connection from dot point 1 to 5. What's the quickest way to get there? I also talk a lot. I interrupt. I've had to work very, very hard on that. I think again, there's also an aspect of this that's like I've been in rooms that have been primarily men, and if I don't interrupt, then I don't get to say anything. But
Mm.
then if it becomes a habit, because sometimes if I don't say something, it's gone. The thought is gone.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've had to work on like writing some stuff down, but it
Hmm.
also makes sense that as a leader, I got to make sure I give people the space that they need to explain what they have and say, like, they need to be heard more than I need to say something. And that thing that I need to say, is there a different way to be able to introduce in the conversation that doesn't require me to say, like, stop, like, and so that's something. Um, I'm sure a lot of people do this, but I overread everyone's expressions. You know? You know when you're like that person like at the gym and someone starts like looking and they're thinking, "Oh my god, they're looking at me because I have that," all eyes are on you. They're not. Like most
Yeah.
people really do not notice or do not care, right? But at work, especially like during Zoom, like you get hyper focused or like, "Ooh, they made a face after I said that.
Hmm.
Why did they make that face?" And so many other things. And with that, the downside of that is that you overread into everything.
Yeah.
You think everyone's statement, you read it how your mindset. When you get a Slack message and someone says like, "Hey, how are you doing?" If you're in a really, really bad mood or you have an idea in your head, you're gonna read it like, "What do you mean, how am I doing?" Like, we have all this context that gets built up, and specifically as an outcome for some, I won't say that all, right? ADHD is not, and anxiety, they're not a monolith, but the idea of what it shows up for me is I've been a person who always has to constantly say like, "Are we okay? Like, are you mad at me?"
Yeah.
It has annoyed my husband for the last 13 years of marriage, but he's still here. But I've had to kind of like work through that on realizing like, regardless of whether or not that phase was directed at me, does it matter? Probably not. Um, and I think one of the more positive sides is quirks that I think still people find quirky is I got a lot of energy. I come with a lot of personality.
Hmm.
And that can be super useful in like talking about really boring topics. I remember doing that. Like I did one around testing for some of the launches that we were doing, and like everyone was done. It was the end of the day. And then by the end of it, people came up to me. I like, got a few laughs and people were like, "That was really, really great. I would like to help with this." And I was like, "Yeah, because if you can just be like exciting and human enough, it's a lot easier to do." And I think you have that sort of like the way that your brain works and how much and how quickly it's firing.
Those are awesome. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like on Zoom, most of the time, people are looking at themselves more than like looking at other people and other people's reactions. But I totally empathize with a lot of your quirks there, and I appreciate you sharing some of those. I think that we've come a long way with like mental health stigma, but it's still there, and
Mhm.
people still think of anxiety, specifically ADHD, as like a limitation. When you were diagnosed and you went on this journey, like what helped you make the shift to seeing it as a strength and something that could actually give you an edge in your Martech career?
Yeah. I think it kind of goes back to the statement of, like we said with tools, all traits and behaviors are also neutral, right? Like the idea of a characteristic that you have, like I've been called, right? Like at work. Um, that trait that I can pull out is super useful in situations where it is required for me to be clear, concise, have a, a very strong opinion. Like, and the concept of then what's put on that sort of word, just because I happen to be female, obviously is, exaggerated. But me having that ability to act in that way or be that way or have that behavior characteristic is considered only a negative thing when it is not welcomed or someone doesn't sort of view it. But there will be situations where it is the perfect tool to sort of use.
Hmm.
The same thing about like when we think about anxiety and ADHD, there's definitely things that because our I don't want to say society because, it depends on what sort of culture, but I would say for the US was not necessarily set up. You were set up to be in a place, to do a thing, to at one point stare at sheets, to then go to a computer, like to sit still, to do this task and to press the buttons and have the thing. And of course, we've evolved so much in terms of like so much of this is about strategy and presentation and things of that sort to where, the when it comes to the type of characteristics that come out with people who have different types of, invisible disabilities or things that you're unable to see. What we need to focus on are the things that using these characteristics that I have more as strengths is figuring out like the neutrality of them and when they are best leveraged to play up or to play down. Um, so, like I said, some of the examples, like I can connect dots pretty quickly. That can be super useful in a operation issue that has like a very long chain of events that happen. So understanding that this was the result we saw, but what are the 15 things that happened
Hmm.
previously? And that can be super annoying in meetings where they want to get to context as quickly as possible, right? So I don't want to see the 15 dots. What happened? How are we fixing it? And what's next, right? Um, and so being able to play between those things, which actually kind of leads to another strength that I know is a characteristic that shows up for people who have ADHD or even combined type, anxiety, um, is understanding your audience because naturally we're always so worried that people are going to dislike us. That they don't. We then mask or we create different versions of ourselves tailored to a person to say,
Hmm.
this is my version I have made for you because this is what I know you need. And I have a desire to be liked or loved or, accepted in some sort of way because that wasn't something that I felt at some point in my life being able to be accepted. I had to alter my personality to fit your expectation. So then you get really good at trying to tailor experiences with your audiences. But people do this all the time. How you are, I'm sure, with your friends, your best buds from whatever time period versus your wife versus, your boss or things of that sort. We all tailor it, right? And this kind of does get to a big point that I have around, people like, everyone bring your true self to work. Totally get it. Yes. We all have certain values and things that are important to us. But I do not think anybody would expect that you act the exact same way. Like you
Yeah.
play up your traits and your values should be equivalent across your life. That would be silly. It's the same thing with these characteristics or these aspects of, mental illnesses or not even illnesses, like I said, more of like a superpower, but your state of being with me with ADHD is just like these things will exist. There's not much I can do except for the fact of, leveraging medication, leveraging different tools like therapy, but I cannot and nor do I want to change the way that my brain thinks too fast, that I like to have really in-depth conversations with strangers, that I have 15 different versions of myself that I all equally love and like that I can take out and have a conversation depending on what that person needs. So that's kind of how I think through it.
Super cool. In-depth conversation with strangers. I feel like that's what I do for a living
Yeah,
almost
it does.
on the
See, it
podcast.
aligns really, really well. It's a super useful skill. Like if you can just meet a person and be like, can you tell me your entire life story? You know? And they're just like, "Yes." And that helps when you also have the personality and energy is like, "I would love to
Right.
open up to you." Which you have that.
Hmm.
You have that face of someone that they just wanna open up to.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Knack. I have the amazing pleasure of chatting with some of the greatest minds in marketing operations, but you'd be shocked at how many of them have the same issues when it comes to their campaign creation process. They're dealing with things like scaling, personalization, keeping assets on brand, render testing emails, working in rigid templates, and worst of all, having to hand code emails. But many of the leaders in the space are using Knack to eliminate these headaches. Knack is a no-code email and landing page creation platform that covers initial campaign requests right until the sync to your marketing automation platform. Knack improves the whole campaign creation process by bringing the building, optimization, testing, collaboration, and also translation functions all in a single spot. So you don't have to jump around and coordinate feedback between a bunch of different people or wait on developers for very simple edits. Because at the end of the day, marketing ops folks want to focus on process and efficiency. Marketers want to focus on creativity, and Knack makes sure you get both and then some. Check them out at knack.com. That's KNAK, and tell them we sent you. This episode is brought to you by MoEngage and their new Warehouse Native CEP, which revolutionizes the way data should be seamlessly fetched, analyzed, and activated. Now you can use MoEngage Cloud Data Sync to sync your warehouse data with MoEngage and use it to segment audiences or personalize messages without any development. Just set and forget. Use MoEngage warehouse segments to create segments on your warehouse data without moving underlying events, properties, or proprietary segmentation logic, and activate them directly on MoEngage. Using warehouse data analytics, brands can also directly generate insights from their warehouse data. Your long search solution for seamless data sync, smarter segmentation, dynamic personalization, and delightful customer experiences ends here. Warehouse native CEP from MoEngage, making it easy, smart, and secure. Learn more at moengage.com. What are the things you mentioned with this like whole shift that helped you achieve and becoming like this idea of a stronger bridge between execution and vision? And I'm curious to ask you, like, what practical advice do you have for folks when it comes to things like how do you make your process more visible? How do you slow down for leadership conversations? And what does leaning into the details with your team look like in this whole context? Walk us through that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I do, and I always feel like I guess it is middle management always has such a interesting and hard job because you have to figure out how to get to the details with the team, but then level it up to the right aspect for, your leaders and what it really means. So, I mean, on a practical sort of advice, the way that I've usually approached, because I have so many conversations on like trade-offs and decisions and things of that sort, is you always list all the options, sometimes even the super bad ones, because they know that you have thought through everything. And, I've been pretty like, you don't do like the really, really, really bad ones, but to a certain extent, it's like, hey, yeah, we could get, an extra $2 million and then go ahead and extend this timeline an extra 2 months and then, throw these 15 engineering teams at this problem. Like, I don't know, like that, it's the idea of saying, like, look, this is all the stops, this is none of the stops. When you're trying to, like, level up a process or an action or a thing that you want them to say yes to or to do to then move forward, whether it's executing some sort of campaign or, evolving your tech stack or rolling out some sort of massive, program. Your goal is not to give them all the details, but to give them all the options for you to be very clear on what option you would recommend and what it would take to get to that sort of point. And then be clear on the trade-offs and resources that come with it. I think like a lot of like leadership conversations, like the details to them are not the details, I think, to people who are natural operators. Like, the details we need to know are like, what day, what am I turning on and off? What are the buttons? What connects here? Or who's it? What's it? For them, the details are more about like, when will this thing be live in a place or a market to where we can understand if it's connecting well with the consumer or the traveler? That's like a deadline. What are the details on saying that this problem that happened 2 months ago will never happen again? What have you done to change that equation? At that point, sometimes it's just like we have fixed it. It was this, and now it's this. And then that's all that they sort of want. And then you always have to have like backup of like documentation. But for the details, your best bet is really to make sure that you understand, and all leaders are different, but most of them, your audience is like, I need to know the details that are critical for me to do my job well, which is understanding across the board of the other 15 teams or leaders that I'm working with when they can depend upon a thing. Another step I would just say is if you're going to step into a meeting and that you don't you don't know what level that they want, you can always ask in kind of like a, it's not a sneaky way, but in a way of saying like, we're going to talk about this today. How much do you know about this topic, and what information would be helpful in order for us all to have the same context? Um, that can be a way, I think, to have a better conversation, because someone might come in and say like, yeah, I know where we're at. I want to know this, and they'll help you get to that point. Then you might have someone say, what is this about? I didn't read the agenda. And in that case, they say it, and then the rest of the room acknowledges, okay, when she starts going through this isn't because she didn't read the room, it's because someone specifically asked for it. So that can be a super, good way of going about it. And when it comes to like slowing down, Their leadership and a lot of who at least I personally report into, but in general in my career, they're always going to want all the things as quickly as possible. To be fair, that is their job, right? Their job is to try to push the sorts of teams. Your ability, especially when you're kind of more in that sort of middle layer, is to be able to explain to get to those things what the cost or what the expectation or expense or trade-off is. You don't have to say explicitly, like, we have to slow down. You do have to explicitly say, it sounds like we want a lot of things, and a lot of these things take a lot of foundational work. And that foundational work isn't necessarily usable. However, it does allow us to go faster once we have it. Given that, this sort of thing, to do it right and to do it well, is at minimum X amount of time. Would you like us to make sure we have this foundational part correct, or would you like us to try to get something out as quickly as possible, knowing that it may not scale?
Hmm.
And it's not about pushing the problem to somebody else, but you don't have to necessarily explicitly state the thing without them being able to arrive. But you always need to have an opinion and recommendation in your back pocket.
Yeah, it's a really cool reframing of it because I feel like your perspective is balancing that whole execution side of thing with the folks that care more about strategy and vision, like you kind of shared, right? I feel
Mhm.
like in your career and a lot of other folks too, when you move up the ladder, so to speak, you kind of do a little bit of ops, hands-on work still operating, but you have to care more about things like strategy and be able to speak the vision, speak and have that exec presence, right? But you've done a bunch of everything when it comes to like execution from ESP migrations to IP
Mhm.
warming projects, lifecycle strategy things. You've had to balance both execution and strategy, but lots of folks think that when they move up in their careers, that's when they need to step away from the hands-on execution stuff and
Mhm.
they need to wear their grown-up pants and think more strategically and team leadership stuff. You've actually said that execution is where differentiation happens. Why do you believe execution deserves way more credit than strategy in marketing ops?
Yeah, yeah. That one's probably definitely, I'm sure I'll ruffle a few feathers on that. And it's probably because I do have a slightly different definition of execution. But I believe anyone, like, we have good ideas all the time, right? How many pieces of work I'm sure that you've done, I've done, anyone who's listening has done, have you just have gone to go die in a file from a PowerPoint deck that you spent like 3 weeks on or something of that sort, right?
So many. The graveyard
So
is massive.
many. It's so big, right? And it's not to say that that was a bad idea. It was about getting the right people to help you execute it. And that's the thing. We all have really good ideas. A really good idea is to solve world hunger. Cool. Have we haven't really figured that out, right? Because the execution of it is challenging. And obviously that's a pretty like big sort of example, but to kind of bring it back to like marketing ops, like we get a lot of really great ideas on how a brand should come to life or how we should connect with a customer or traveler or whoever it might be. But your ability to be able to get from point A to point B, if you end up having an excellent strategy that you feel it's like foolproof, and then your execution falls apart, was it a good strategy? Like,
Mm,
and some of the times it can be the fact, like, obviously the tooling wasn't set. And I have seen where it was a pretty good strategy and we didn't have the platform to really support it. So then we went out and we invested more in our platform to make sure that it could go out. But that means that that strategy would have never seen the light of day unless we fixed the execution, unless we allowed people to scale, and so when I mean that in execution, it's like the idea of button pushing, right?
mhm,
But my kind of expanded definition of that is the idea execution is being able to get people on board with an idea and a concept enough to get whatever you decided in that strategy to market.
hmm.
And we all work, I think, I mean, there are very few people that I know, and I'm like, yeah, I do it all and I push all the buttons and set up all the strategy. But most of the time, it's convincing a whole bunch of people. that don't work for you nor on your team to say, please, can you do this thing for me? Because it's going to make my life easier. It'll probably make your life easier. I promise. I'll shout to the world on how wonderful you were. But it is a lot about that. It's execution is about persuading people as well. And that is a leadership skill set that isn't about necessarily generating the idea, but regardless of whether or not it's your idea or a good idea, getting other people to be able to say yes, a committed yes, I will do it. That itself, I believe, deserves a lot more strategy or a lot more credit than the
Mhm.
strategy.
It's such a cool way to think about it. So how do you think like we fix this? Like if you think of your typical leadership team in big companies, it's made up primarily of people that are vision high up in the sky, strategy level folks. And there isn't a ton of representation from individual contributors and people that understand
Mhm.
what pushing the buttons actually means and the impact and the work behind it
Mhm.
and all of that stuff. Like how do we fix that? Like how do we get more representation of execution and IC folks in leadership teams?
Yeah. No, I would, like I said, I have a strategy and idea, but whether or not it executes, we'll see if anybody else wants to take that. But I think so. I think one thing foundationally is that one, good operators from earlier in their career to the point of reaching some sort of C-suite, if they truly have that sort of point of view, hopefully, and I'm speaking maybe to myself if I ever get to that point, is the idea that they take that sort of understanding with them as they grow. And it is about getting people who have been in the weeds in those sorts of positions, right? And so it is about the idea, like even when I see traditional like CMO roles, a lot of them have branding or agency or creative sort of experience. That's great, cool. But we all know that there's an aspect of the benefits of having someone who has been a operator, who has worked in technology, who understands the underlying functions of data and um, customer research and that stuff that I think goes a little bit broader. And so I think it's just about getting a really good mix there. In terms of bringing like individual contributors a little bit more close to it, I think the you have to find an individual contributor who understands kind of what I stated beforehand, that you cannot get so bogged down into the details of like, well, if this, then that, then this, because then you're going to lose them on those
Yeah.
sorts of things. You have to match them, you have to meet them where they're at. And for leaders, where that's at is we have a thing we want to do. It's going to drive something that's super important to us. I would like to get that done as quickly as possible. And then in your side, like I said, it's coming to the table of saying, cool, I totally understand. I agree it's important. I would like to help. Here's what I need in order to make that happen. Because at this time, we cannot do X, Y, and Z. Then at that point, they get curious. Well, why can't we? Great question. Let me tell you some more. So it's all about kind of saying, aligning with what they want, understanding what that might be, and then being able to dive a little bit deeper. To get that sort of representation, like at the tables, I've seen some really great things that I know at places that I've worked have been the idea of creating these like groups where you do bring in someone who has a very special interest or very, unique understanding of something, and you bring them to the leadership table. Now, at first, the expectation should be like, just listen, try to understand what they're trying to say. But then eventually you get to that point where they're saying, we need you to come back with like a thing. It's all
Mhm.
about those leaderships teams, not just talking to and at each other, but bringing in the people occasionally to gut check the sorts of challenges that we have on getting things out the door. And I know that's something that I personally do, is that I always try to take those voices that exist and say, hey, sounds like we got a problem. I'm going to raise it over here. Can you help me frame it up? And then if it gets enough traction, I say, cool, you're going to be presenting on this date. Can you please talk to them about this and what you need to be sort of successful? But it does require people to carry those voices throughout, especially when it comes to people who are like hands on keyboards doing that sort of work.
Yeah, such a good advice. Like having the people in icy shoes speak firsthand. Like it's one thing to have, the layers of management and someone at the top getting the intel from an IC on their team and then taking their own spin on that, like they're
Yeah.
playing telephone, right? And then they bring it to the leadership team and they're like, I think he said something or she said
Yes.
something like this. And then she explained, I'll have to double check. Like I didn't take notes when she was explaining it to me, but we have something wrong with like our domain reputation right now. And
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
love using email deliverability as an example there. I know that's also close to your heart.
Yes.
But
So
yeah,
close.
it's really good advice. Like something else that you said kind of related to this that I felt deeply when I was reading some of your notes there. Like you've described yourself as someone with deep passion who had to learn discernment and the muscle of indifference. And your advice is basically like, not every battle is worth the fight. And I felt this profoundly because I've always had issues figuring out what are the battles that are worth fighting for because I felt passionate about a lot of the things that I had my hands in.
Mhm.
And as someone who is also very passionate about work and sometimes borders on like taking criticism a bit personally, I need to lean on this advice. So, like, how do you decide today at which battles to fight and which ones to kind of let go and save for another day?
Oh man, it's been a rough journey. And it's like flexing a muscle. And here's the thing is like you just never get it perfect. You just get a little bit better at refining like what matters. Um and I know I don't have it like down today cuz even today like the amount of times I wanted to jump into a conversation meetings we were having and I was just like that like I wanted and I was just like doesn't really matter. It was so funny. It was a question was brought up is like, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And
Mm.
I, there's also a part like those two things can coexist at the same time. But in some situations, it's like, I don't have to be right. I'm totally good. What the group wants, I'm more than happy to help facilitate. It is not the hill I will die on today. And that was something that literally happened today. And like I said, this is like very, very common, I'm assuming, against anyone in these sorts of leadership, especially when it comes to a place where you are bridging both the idea of like a marketing strategy, right? Which there's some science behind it, but there's also a whole bunch of these like feels and what people expect to be good and things of that sort. And then, of course, you have the other side, the technology, right? Which, can be it it is very flexible, but it's also very rigid, right? Like if a thing doesn't work, then it's just not gonna plug in. And then you have to do the 85 steps to kind of get it to that. And being in that sort of place, like translating back and forth and having sort of conversations back and forth, it ends up putting you in a lot of places where you get into intense creative discussions or arguments. You get into some arguments, some disagreements, and there's a lot of
Hmm.
healthy friction that can exist, but sometimes
Right.
there isn't, and that's when you have to decide. So when I get into those points, and I don't go through all four of these questions every single time, because sometimes I just get to the first one and I'm like, oh, so not gonna doesn't matter then. I first ask like, does this thing block or enable momentum? So this point that has come up that I want to refute or I want to challenge or I want to do, does this me bringing this thing up, does it actually help us start to move forward? Or is it me just trying to get a point out that,
Hmm.
or is it me trying to like stop a thing that I just don't think is valuable? Like if the goal of when you're having discussions, you're not trying to win, you're trying to get to a point that everyone is just trying to understand what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how is it important? And all of that is about getting momentum, getting people to say, I'm committed to doing this thing and not like a counterfeit yes, but like an actual like, yes, I'm in. Um, if it makes me feel weird. So if I like get to a point where I'm like, why am I getting bothered by this? Like, why is this a thing that's like, ugh? Is it because I just spent 3 weeks working on it and someone tore it down in less than 3 minutes? Is it because, I actually disagree foundationally with this thing? Or is it because, like, they don't have this piece of information that is going to fundamentally
Hmm.
change the entire thing? They're missing something, and that's not their
Yeah.
fault. I have new information. They don't have it. Let me tell them. And so when it's making me sort of feel weird, I just try to question that, like, what is this kind of coming from? Because sometimes it's like conflicting with like a value, but sometimes it's just ego. It's like I have to say the thing because I'm the leader in the room. But sometimes I'm like, no, you don't have to ask questions or you don't have to say something to be important. Um, and then I ask whether it's a problem or noise. So is this actually like a thing that is worth bringing up because it's like, oh my gosh, this is a real problem? Or is this just like a thing right now that everyone's frustrated? We just redid the project plan like for the billionth time. Like, where are we at with this? Is this just sort of noise? And then the last one that's so important, I think, in kind of deciding this is like, do you have the energy? Everyone always talks about time, right? Like, do I have the time? Okay. Your time, technically, everyone knows, is a certain amount of hours, certain amount of minutes, certain amount of seconds in a day. And I still refute the fact that everyone has the same 24 hours in a day. People have variety of different experiences where those 24 hours do not equate to what they would be capable of doing. But energy, right, that kind of depends a little bit on the person and what they have based on their wellness, their situation, their environment, and what they have to give at that time. And sometimes there are things that maybe answer yes to all those questions, but I just don't have the energy. I do not have it. And is not something that I'm willing to then sacrifice where I've saved my energy to go bike riding with my son or, on a date night with my husband, that I reserve that energy and I put it someplace else. So it's not perfect, but like I said, is it about blocking or enabling momentum? Is this making you feel weird and why? Question it. And is that a value thing or an ego thing? Is it actually a real problem or is it just noise? And then probably most importantly, you might want to put that one up at the front is it worth my energy? Sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay.
That's such great advice. I feel like a lot of folks listening, going back and replaying battles that they've had or arguments, like stages of storming and figuring out, do I say this thing? Do I try to push this? Do I not? And there's always this like internal conflict and reflecting on like, is this ego? Is it something that they're missing that you just need to like inform them about? Is it a mix of kind of all of those things, right? Like, is it really stopping the project from hitting its goal? It's such great advice. I feel like, what like how do you teach this to your team? Like, are there like, aside from, like, asking those questions and then deciding whether you have that energy, like, I feel like it's a good framework. Like, how do
Mhm.
you figure out, like, what energy looks like in that situation? Like, for me, like, I'll give you an example, like, I'll use email deliverability again. Like, I'll go back to a case. I was at a startup and we had really poor email deliverability issues, and a lot of the implementation execution work was on the IT team to get
Mhm.
new records set up in DNS, and like I didn't have access to all of those things, and so I just needed things to get done really, really quick. And I explained a lot of the things, probably went too much into the details
Mhm.
at that level. And instead of folks just being like, yeah, this is critical, like we'll get this done right away, like thanks for the context, Phil, I was faced with resistance because they didn't have all the context despite me oversharing the level of information. But I felt like I took it personally that there was resistance to my solutions or my suggestions
Mm.
based on the 12 years of email deliverability experience that I have in marketing and all that stuff. And they were just like, well, we're not sure about like having all of our emails to customers be on a separate subdomain. Like, why would we have to do that? And it's just like that part of it, like I have the energy to do that or not? I don't know. Like, how important is this thing to getting through the door? I don't know if that makes sense. Like that whole energy thing, like I get it. I feel it more after the fact. So like, how do you train your team to be more mindful about that battery of energy at work, and like, what's going to drain it, what's not going to drain it? I feel like it's easier said than done, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, on email deliverability, I think, as your example, it can be so rough with that, and the good news is for mine, it's attached to a copious amount of money, so it was like, "Cool, this is how much money it's losing. We all go do work? Yes, we're on it."
Yeah.
I was like, "That's what I thought." But yeah, you're right. It's kind of like this idea of things that we're deeply attached to, right? That are super important to us, and that's where it can be really, really hard. Which is actually why I think some aspects of like AI, the ability for us to be able to produce the amount of work we do a little bit, faster and quicker. We have a better ability to detach because I didn't spend a copious amount of time trying to get this. I've lessened the amount of time and effort I've invested in a thing, but the output is still solid. This sort of same thing kind of happens when we're thinking about what sort of things we can go after. It's very human for us to say, when I feel attacked, or when I feel the thing that I value is not being valued by others, then that means I need to go on defense. I need to say, but why, and be upset and react versus respond. And that's human, right? There's technically nothing wrong with that. However, we work in a corporate world where that is not acceptable. And then that's what gets you interesting labels throughout the sort of time. And so in teaching teams, one, each of their values are going to be different, right?
Mm.
Like, so the things that are important to me as a person are very different than maybe some of the other people on my team in terms of what they either personally value or how they view their work. Which is why I produce like an operating manual that I send to my team, and I say, I don't want you to guess all my funny, quirky stuff. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, this is how I am. And when I say this, it never means like this. Like, I kind of walk them through that because I don't want them to have expectations in their head about me that aren't necessarily true, that I never put out. But when it comes to the things that understanding for them what's important, like discernment, as we know, is not about doing less. It's about doing the things that are ideally going to move the needle, and your ability to judge well on essentially like what things deserve that energy to move the needle, to make things go further. Um, and in the ops world, specifically in marketing ops, there's places where like if you drop the ball, like nobody else picked it up. Like,
Mhm.
and so you sometimes don't have that ability, right? But you do have accountability that you can make sure that the teams that are responsible for fixing it, that you follow through on those sorts of things. And so in each of like my team, I try to make sure that they understand that sometimes there's a thing I say, it's just email. We're not in the ER. Like that no one's going to die. We do need to be responsive. We do need to do our job well, but this is like this is just marketing. We're okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
um the second thing is I do try to I don't believe in busy. I only believe in prioritization. And sometimes I tell people, just look at your prioritization list. If this thing is falling below your energy and your capacity, then guess what? It doesn't matter because we always care about the things that are urgent. If my house caught fire right now, I guarantee I'd be off this podcast, right? Because that's the most important thing. But right now,
Right.
you are the most important thing, which is, so it's how we think about those sorts of things. So in
Mm.
general, I do talk to my team in terms of kind of like that checklist that I go through is like, what is this thing going to enable? Why is this making us feel funny? And in meetings, it's kind of sometimes you have to say something or not say something really quickly. I think a lot of the time you have to kind of fiddle with that depending upon your audience that you have, right? And think of like worst case scenarios. You say something and someone's like, "Yeah, cool, whatever." Or if you say something and then it completely changes the trajectory of something negatively or positively. And so that you just have to learn. You have to do stuff. Um, but I think when it comes to like, my directs, it's just that idea of people who directly report into me is like, what what can we just let go? Like,
Mhm.
do you plan to think about this thing for the next 2 weeks? Is it really that important? If it is something you're really interested in and you think is critical, I will plant that flag next to you. We will die on that hill together. But I do like you have to be aware that sometimes this thing that means so much to this other person and takes you so little effort to do, what's that cost?
Mhm.
Just go ahead and do it. But if a thing that cost you a lot and that's not something that you think is of value, is it worth having that conversation and figuring
Yeah.
that out? So, can't necessarily there's ways to think about it, but it's a hard one. I don't even know what I'm doing, to be perfectly honest.
I don't think anyone does, but you had fantastic advice, Angela. I feel like we could keep chatting for a couple hours here. Like I love your point about I don't believe in busy. I just believe in having a prioritized list. And it's such a cool reframing because it's so easy to say like I'm so busy, there's so many things going on right now. And it's like, all right, chill. Like make your list. Like what are the most important things right now and all the other you have in your head, like just keep that for later. Like that's goes back
Mm,
to the whole topic about anxiety. Like for me, battling anxiety throughout my career, it's always been about this feeling of being overwhelmed, like not
mm,
being able to fall asleep at night because I have these 17 things going on. And when I went through a mindfulness journey, I learned to put things in a box and save them to later because like the world isn't ending right now. We're working in email. We're not saving babies. Like, it's gonna be okay. Just put stuff in a box and worry about it later. Yeah, Angela, it's been a super fun conversation. I got one last question for you. We usually say like, let's bring things back to the humans because we are the Humans of Martech podcast. But I feel like the whole conversation has been about humans. So this has been a super fun conversation. Angela, you're a marketing exec at a 10K person, 15 billion public company. You're a team leader, obviously, forever an execution minded operator. You're also a speaker, a writer, but you're also a mother of two, and you've got a ton of hobbies on the side like gardening, interior design, woodworking, rock climbing, biking, photography, a bunch of other ones. Clearly, you got a ton of stuff going on in your life. Like, one question we ask everyone on the show is, how do you remain happy and successful in your career? And how do you find balance between all the stuff you're working on while staying happy?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's, that question around, like, happiness, like, it's something that it's just so normal that we try to, like, ask you, like, what will make you happy?" And it's, like, one of those questions that almost everyone has the same answer, but it's never exactly said in the same way, which, I
Hmm.
mean, says something. There's some sort of universal truth to this thing, and so the way that I thought about it is, for me, it was at one point one thing. It was all about success, however I defined success at that time, which was usually a lot of different activities, right? Just fill my thing with stuff to do. And not only fill it, but be good at it. And then if I wasn't good at it or someone told me I was bad at it, then I was no longer successful. So therefore, I could not be happy. I'm glad to say, as the joy of parenthood, for those who have experienced it, it's I know it's said all the time, but man, it does change you. And so with that, for me, it is no longer just one thing. I think of happiness now as like a formula, but just like in any sort of formula, you have all these factors, right? And these factors can actually exist in a ton of different emotional states. So I know sometimes the goal is to feel like I want to be happy, but I also want to sometimes feel grief or sadness or all the other things that are frustrated, angry, disappointed, um, you know, and I'm sure I've gone through all those emotions today, just like in all the meetings that I've had, right? And I know there's like a state of wanting to be happy. And I think generally that most of the time I am, but I've also recognized in my life that I'm not. And it doesn't mean that those periods of my life were not you know, weren't worthwhile or something of that sort. But all of this to say is like when I think of my formula of like what brings me happiness is are the values that I have being honored in an environment, in a place, and by people that I love, that I hold dear to me? Do I have do I get to pick my chosen challenges? I think a lot of the time we have challenges put upon us. And this is the idea of like growth, right? Everyone talks about like, I want growth. And usually most of the time you get growth is because you've been challenged, because you've worked out at the gym and now you have bigger muscles, because, you've watered the tree. You've done some sort of activity that isn't necessarily easy that has allowed you to change the way in which you think about things. And I think being able to choose some of those things, which I'm very fortunate, I know not everyone gets that, is a part of my happiness. Discernment, just as we talked about,
Hmm.
realizing what things are important and what things aren't, prioritization. And then also recognizing that there's growth and rest phases. I think it's so hard for us who are just constantly go, 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 that the idea that there's times in your life where your rest isn't like, I'm going to sit on the sofa and do nothing. It is just more about the idea of giving yourself grace and space to not climb a ladder, but to explore a landscape and be okay with that. And that it doesn't have to mean that you have to keep getting better at a thing. Sometimes you can just do a thing because it's enjoyable. And so, how I remain happy is playing up each of these things. And sometimes it's all of them, sometimes it's only one of them. But I always have a little bit of happiness there. And then sometimes those pieces go into other places to where I'm not so happy, but I'm definitely able you know, to understand what would get me to that place of happiness.
So cool. I've asked this question over almost 200 times now to 200 different people, and you're probably my favorite answer. Even though you said like a lot of the answers are like a different like spin on the same answer, your formula reframing of it and like would you say space and grace to explore landscape? I love it. It's such a cool answer, Angela.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's true, or at least it's true for me. But I hope that other people start to think of their happiness in that way too, because it can be so hard when it's tied to this one thing, because you
Hmm.
are not one thing. Humans are multidimensional. They have so many different factors, and you should be okay with recognizing all of them, including all of my super fun different traits as someone with ADHD.
Angela, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great speaking with you too, Phil. Thank you for having me.